All right, Ace Forest, welcome to Adventures in Wellbeing.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, brother, I want to bring you into a little moment that's happening down here. My wife is quite pregnant, and she's due any moment. And
Ah,
yeah, it's good news. It's super exciting. And she's been putting together a playlist for her birthing. And to say that you are featured on that playlist would be an understatement. And she's got the entire album of music to be born to on there. And it seems like every time we hear another song, she yells out to me. She's like, "Oh my God, what is this? I must add it to my playlist." So we're huge fans of yours and really appreciate you
cool.
taking a moment here.
Well, if she goes into labor, feel free to bounce.
Yeah, totally.
I think I'll understand. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Give us a little bit of foundation of who East Forest is and what your work has been about.
I don't know. I just a guy who's trying to sort things out for myself, and so I started using music as a way to guide myself into or sort of shamanic states, inner states, and that just grew over the years. But I'm still very interested in that, and I realized that a lot of other people have similar interests or needs. Surprise, surprise. We're all human beings in this same predicament. And it's been a real honor and a blessing to continue to be able to do that day to day in lots of different formats. So it's really expanded in the different, modalities. But core of it is I love music. I love creativity. It helps me keep my head on straight. And it's just such an amazing tool to get in touch with the ineffable.
Yeah. I mean, I get the sense, I mean, obviously whether I think one of the albums was for psychedelic therapists. And the first track on that album was, for my wife who's moving through something, for the first time that is really kind of powerful and sacred and rich in all the ways. Like even those tracks for her were speaking to her. And so I guess the other thing that happened, I was, just looking into, who is East Forest in preparation. And I came across kind of like the musical genre that somebody might have tried to fit you into. And it was quite comical. It was like, 5 different genres, including like indie pop and all sorts of stuff. But when I think about it and when I listen and connect with the music, it almost is like, it's like music for the sacred or music for, for the special moments of life. How is it that has come to be this genre that you've followed?
Well, I just really wanted and want to get in touch with feelings that are bigger than the mundane in a sense, or just feel that yearning that perhaps we all have in the background to be back with the source or to be whole or to be not separate. And all of that I hear at least is an illusion, but sometimes it feels very real. And music is just one of those things that I would listen to music and certain pieces, especially a couple times in my life when they're combined with psilocybin. It felt like I touched that place. It's an indescribable place, but there's a place in your heart is there, but you're trying to find it or touch it or awaken it or speak to it. And so I just had to, honestly, it's from like a deep depression and a feeling of disconnect, a deep wanting to be there, that I'm really just trying different things. I thank God I tried that method as to something more destructive. And this has just been a largely positive experience. I mean, the creativity has been a very positive experience, but I think Ram Dass said something about that once you realize that it's about walking home or returning home, I mean, there's only one game in town after that in many ways. Like everything is about that. So I think when I had some of those numinous experiences, there wasn't much else to do but sing to the sacred and even within that, kind of label, everything is sacred. And so even songs that are maybe not overtly ethereal or something, to me, there's a glue that holds it together. And it's really a kind of celebration of human spirit or whatever creativity is, which I think is just kind of a pure source energy coming out of us in all forms, not just my music or anything, all creativity. So, but that definitely seems to be like the color I tend to go into a lot. And before this project, I was exploring lots of other things, and my music was not like that. So it just sort of emerged back in 2008 from my work with psilocybin quite directly, and then guiding people with music. So, very literally, I had to figure out, okay, what music was working for this activity. And that most definitely shaped the sound. I mean, music to be born to that you just talked about, like that's recordings from a mushroom ceremony, live and improvised. So, music to die to, same thing. She can use that too. It's all the same energy. It's all sort of the same thing.
So I get the sense, or maybe which came first? Was it spirituality came first and psychedelics were assistive and music came out of that, or was there some other kind of path?
Well, they emerged concurrently, but it's like I had experiences with psilocybin that I didn't understand. I like stumbled into the spirituality in a sense, and I think this happens for a lot of people. Growing up in the suburbs and sort of bereft of any religion, and an atheist father, an agnostic mother. It was just sort of adrift in a depressive American dream, and I didn't have any backbone to rely on, or even really resist against or react against. So I didn't have psychedelic experiences until a little later in life, as in college, and it was probably a good thing, I'm thinking, but they were largely positive, most of them, and I didn't have a ton, but they were really profound because I had no teachers, and I had no backbone or some sort of lineage to put it up against to understand what that was. And there wasn't much information back then out there that you could just find on the internet. There was no YouTube and so forth. So it was a long road of sort of reverse engineering or unpacking that. I mean, honestly, that goes on forever. But at that time in particular, it took me probably close to a decade to kind of start to think like, wait a minute, there's paths that could take me to these places that could a layer on top of this. And in one of those, including music itself. I mean, for many years, I was exploring music in other forms and not at all aligning it with the inner path, or certainly not psychedelics in any way. So it kind of found me. It just happened.
Yeah, if I think about my early days of exploration in terms of drugs and just life, and essentially at the core of that is that we're trying to feel better, aren't we? We're trying to kind of solve some sort of yearning or some sort of emptiness or some itch that needs to be itched inside of us. And we're kind of as young people typically kind of pushing into all the arenas to try and navigate to something that feels right. And it seems that you've been lucky actually to find a path that actually has delivered on that.
Totally lucky for sure. But I wouldn't say I figured it all out by any means. It's just I feel lucky that I'm able to create and be creative, and not only have that as a job, but it's like, because it's a job, that means in some ways you're supposed to do it every day, but because then that actually is what makes me feel good. So it's a real blessing that I'm able to nourish myself by sort of creating this world. That's a real privilege to have been able to do that. That then feeds my own soul and keeps my heart open, because it's a tough world out there for all of us.
Yeah. So quite literally, I mean, I guess I imagine, because you're a modern musician, who both plays instruments and also works in the digital realm. And so for you, is the creation process actually nourishing, or is the live process nourishing? What does that practice feel like when it's feeling
Well,
good?
yeah, I mean, both, they're very different. I mean, a lot of creating is solo, alone. Like before this, I was working on some music cues for the Music for Mushrooms film. We're working on documentary, and performing is like such another beast. Uh, you can get some real highs with that, of course, but it's some real tension as well, or anxiety, or just it's pressure. Anytime you have to do something at a particular time in a particular way, and there's people there with expectations, that can be a lot, but that's also why it can be really exciting, and it's a kind of reciprocity. But my live setup is pretty technical, and that has its own experiences that I have to work with. But look, the creative process in general has ups and downs, and lots of times where you think something is just not working at all, and then you listen to it the next time, and you feel like it's the best thing you've ever done. You're just like, what's going on? And if anything, just over the years, and I've been doing this for 20 years, and I think what you learn more is that rhythm, and you're like, yep, that's how it goes. It goes up, it goes down, it goes left, it goes right. You just sort of keep on the path. And I've heard like that's the description of a professional versus an amateur. In some ways, it's like you don't quit. You're just like, yeah, that's the thing. That's the human humility or the humanity of it, and you just keep putting your hands on the keys or one foot in front of the other.
And do you see creativity as something that is like when you're chatting with your friends and they're like, "Oh my God, I don't understand how you play the keys and sing," and like I think a lot of people don't give themselves the space to do what you were just talking about. Uh, do you feel like it's something that is missing in a world where like if a friend is struggling a bit, would you kind of go, "Hey man, like when was the last time you did something creative and just gave yourself a no pressure space to grab a paintbrush or dance or whatever?"
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I see it myself. If I don't do that even for a few days, I start to feel like I'm sinking a bit. And I think all people, I mean, it's also, there's a lot of scientific backing more and more that's coming out about how powerful creativity and art is for the brain. Uh, just listening to music or looking at art, even for 15 minutes, creates a kind of nourishment and plasticity, a sort of abatement of degenerative, like Alzheimer's and so forth. It's unbelievable. So I mean, you take it up a notch to singing in the shower, like there's a kind of creation happening, or even more like painting something. It doesn't matter how good it is, so to speak. It's just about the creation, and I think that's what we're here to do as people is create. That's all we do. It's just whether we want to do it more consciously or we're just letting it run in the background.
Yeah, and it seems to me in my own life that there's creation under certain context where maybe I'm like, banging out an email, or I don't know, there's some kind of doingness, I guess, which, it's hard to draw the line between creation and just kind of, doing. But then there seems to be really something special with like a sort of openness and a non-pressured kind of goal-oriented sort of process that occasionally I'm lucky enough to get into, whether that's with nature or or even just with with somebody, it seems really special. And yet I don't think it's taught. Like I don't think we as a culture kind of really support people in in being in those spaces.
Not as much. I mean, less and less. Is that a priority? And I do think it's part of just our mental health. It's a part of what it means to be humans. You cut that off, and we start to feel sick in a way. So particularly when we're in a sort of improvisational flow, kind of. So that's a clear thing in music, but what are other ways that can come in our lives where you're essentially making things up in the moment, and there's a sense of play to it. I think that's where a particular magic happens.
Play, for sure. You touched on these early days of create. It sounded like you were creating in the early eras of facilitating psychedelic trips, that it was musically oriented, that you were creating soundscapes, or were you more as a speaking facilitator in those experiences?
No, musical guidance primarily. Yeah. A friend of mine got really into my first record, The Education of the Individual Soul, and he started organizing circles. His name's Lewis. And he just kept doing it, doing it, and doing it to this day. And eventually it became a plant medicine church, and thousands of people have come through. And I wouldn't be doing this if it wasn't for that. I just was stepping into a kind of invitation, and I had to figure it out as I went along, learning from what I could learn from, whether that's actual ceremonies, indigenous ceremonies, or whatever was out there about sound healing and different methods. I just kind of put it all together into my own artistic predilections, and this is what came out. So it is most definitely a mixture of Western popular music in a lot of ways, and a mixture of like acoustic and electronic and elements of pop and classical, and it's a mashup, sort of like me as a person.
What have you learned? I mean, especially for people who are maybe hesitant around psychedelics. I recently, my mother turned 80, and she decided, I asked my mother sounds a bit like your parents, where she, well, I would say she's spiritual, but like clean. Like my mother really didn't drink my whole life. She certainly didn't do any drugs of any kind. And for her 80th birthday, she decided she wanted to do ayahuasca. And so she and I know she went full power. And so the two of us went down to the jungle of Costa Rica and did 4 nights of plant medicine. And it was like one of the peak experiences of our lives together. It was really, it was super incredible. It's not easy, is it? It's, she was doing the work, as was I and others, but I would say she greeted death a couple of times, and she reconnected with sensuality, and I think she and I had a moment where we like just saw each other, like, I don't know how to describe it, but like cleanly, like just saw each other as we are, not as mother, son. And, there was, I mean, some absolutely unforgettable moments that I don't think would have happened. I don't think they would have happened without Mother Ayahuasca getting in there and doing her magic and guiding us along. Yeah. What have you learned in your years? You've mentioned mushrooms. Is there any kind of when you're speaking to somebody, do you facilitate now not only through music but through kind of guided conversation more as a kind of a therapist, or is it only through music still today?
I'm not a therapist, but I do other things. I do guided meditations. I put a lot of that out on my podcast, and then I have a Patreon that's like, we call it the Council, and we do monthly gatherings where I'm really just being the facilitator and then guiding people through a live musically guided and verbally guided meditations. We also, my partner and I, Rada, facilitate retreats. We're just about to go to Costa Rica for a psilocybin retreat that we're guiding. And so in that way, I suppose it's different methods, but in the actual ceremony space, you're creating a container or protocol, sort of guidelines, like, hey, this is how we're going to do this. This is how we're going to support you. This is what's expected of each other. But once we get into it, it's the music that's just taking us through the whole thing. There's very little talking, if any, moving through it.
And when you have a friend, say, that comes to you that has had a bad trip, or somebody that's really skeptical of say mushrooms, how do you speak to them, or how do you guide somebody?
I mean, I listen, and I don't know, I can never say I understand that experience fully because I wasn't in it with them. I've had difficult experiences, and I don't think there's one answer for that, other than sometimes it's challenging. It can be hard work. It can be confusing. It could be any number of things going on. And that's sort of why we do ceremony and why we prepare in different ways and why we give something over to something larger than ourselves, whether it's an altar or a friend guiding us. These are all just ways to try to set us up for success. That's really why I put the music out there. I intend to be best used when it's guiding ceremony space, because I think there's no stronger guide than the music. So it's the most democratized tool we have. And it's also one, at least in modern ceremonies, is talked about the least or perhaps utilized the worst. And so I'm trying to provide a solution or an option for people to try. And I think it can be very effective, very powerful.
Yeah, for sure. Any pitfalls that you notice? I mean, I guess when I even if I look at my own life, I can remember experiences where, I was taking a psychedelic out in, some club, or environments that I think were affecting what was going on. Um, and I also, I guess there's kind of two parts of it, potentially I know that I've put myself into spaces that were really difficult and might have kind of spun me and my experience. But then also, I guess, some of the moments where I've had what you might call a bad trip also held in that hardness and that real struggle, I guess, some of the gems, some of the insights of where all this crap is coming from. Do you have any observations on what you would see in culture as being supportive versus destructive?
Well, maybe like all of culture right now is going through a tough trip. It's hard for us, but it's a kind of medicine we need. Um, I just again I think like having support, and so it's like you don't have to go these things alone. And even just having someone in the room or having a community or people to work on that kind of keep you accountable or keep you grounded in your own integrations. You're not like in delusion, because that's also a big danger, I think, is people getting deluded or self-aggrandizing in ways that's not so much about an us, it's more about an I. And so you got to have a sense of community, something to be the mirror to you, to reflect back to you where you've been, where you are, and also keeping ourselves honest. And then, of course, just having that witness is very powerful. So you don't feel like you're in some kind of vacuum. And witnessing others, flipping it around and being of other people, being of service for their growth and their ceremonies is another way to kind of keep it a full circle and keep it holistic for you, and probably nourish you in the ways you're looking for. But if you can give it to somebody else, I think that's really, really important.
And you're talking about there basically this kind of relationship where one person essentially remains sober and the other person, say takes some mushrooms and one is just a sitting. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Terrence McKenna used to joke like all you need for a sitter is someone to pop their head in the door every now and then and just to go like, everything's cool. Or, or you just ring a bell and they pop in and, they're sort of like a tether, so you can feel safe and let go. And of course, to keep you safe, should you actually be in any sort of strange danger or get confused, they're there to just kind of keep guardrails on and do the minimum that they need to do, the absolute minimum that is necessary.
And so is the typical format, I've never actually been with a sitter. I mean, even when we did ayahuasca, I'm pretty sure most, maybe not everyone actually, maybe there were a couple of people that didn't take any ayahuasca, but I felt like the shamans and those kind of facilitating that space were actually also taking the medicine. And I've never had kind of, I guess, what I see, from maps and some of the more uh I guess structured set in settings. I've never had the experience of just maybe sitting one on one or even a small group with one or sitting with somebody who's actually trained as a psychedelic therapist. Um, where do you see, is it's just, I guess what you're saying is it's just valuable to have someone there, period.
Well, you're right. It depends on the situation. I mean, I think it's a luxury. Uh, but it depends where you're at in your practice too, and your skill set and what medicines you're working with and where you are. But in general, like especially in groups, it's not a bad idea if there's one person that's sort of like the guardian in a way. And yeah, you're right. Traditionally in ayahuasca, the shaman is drinking, but usually there's sort of helpers, assistants with that shaman, and they often drink too, but maybe not as much. And they often still have people in the room who are only take a tiny bit, who are sort of like those guardians. Um, but hey, there are no rules. It's like whatever works for you. And I've had someone helping me once, and I was in a really difficult journey, and there's not much they could do. So, but I think it would have been worse if I was alone. I'd be even more frightened. I'd be like, I don't, I was very confused.
Hmm. Have you I guess been in spaces where you guys were traditional or intentionally working with people dealing with trauma? Uh, Or is that just
Um,
kind of something that occasionally is there?
yes and no. Um, my partner is a ketamine therapist, and that's most of what's going on there in their clinic is explicitly people working with trauma. And I think inevitably we're all working with forms of trauma, and some of us bigger forms of trauma. And sometimes you know about that with folks, and sometimes you don't. But I think in group experiences, we tend to screen out maybe stuff that's a little riskier because perhaps the group is not the best environment to take those risks. It certainly could, but it may be distracting, or you might not be able to provide the level of support that maybe you might want to if something were to arise. So it's really just about people's safety. I tend to be a bit more conservative in my approach than some people who are just like, go for it. I'm more of a harm reduction approach.
Yeah, for sure. Even in dosage, I assume you're not kind of like take the heroic dose on your first try.
It depends again what someone wants or who they are, all this sort of thing. But I'm not the person who thinks you need to have a giant dose in order to have a certain kind of experience. There's a sweet spot where uh, you can still do work essentially, but be fully not in control, as opposed to like you hardly even remember it. It was so like out there, and some people need that, and sometimes that happens. That's totally fine. But I wouldn't say that's my like goal.
You and I met in 2018, and at Esalen, that was the first time we met, and I wasn't in the retreat that you were. I believe you were facilitating, but what I remember of it, and I wish I was on that retreat, um, was that I think you were taking live recordings of people's heartbeats, and then you were using the heartbeat rhythms to create live tracks. Was that
Yeah, that
correctly
was
remembered?
back with Mikey Siegel. That was his group flow project where I was. Yeah, he wired up people's is a few things. It was their breathing, their heart rate, and sometimes their emotional response, which is another like band you put around your, or maybe that was one on the arm. And we take this data and aggregate it to these lights. So everyone had a LED light that represented their heartbeat, it was blinking with their heartbeat. But then we also had this central globe light where we could send the data to that. It would essentially aggregate the whatever 12 or 15, 20 people we had. And then we also had speakers and a subwoofer, so I could move the sound of a heartbeat to the sub, which is a pretty powerful experience to hear your own heartbeat coming out of a subwoofer. And then you could take the lights and like hand it to someone else, and they could hold your heart, and then it would, and we could just manipulate the sound of the light. And then I was playing live music to that, and I had these like MIDI controllers and buttons where I could switch the sounds, so sort of like the heartbeats could become frogs, lots of different frogs, and I'd play music to it. It was a trip. It was it was a lot. Mikey was he's a bold man with that technology, and I was just it was definitely his. That was my first time at Eslam. That was like maybe we did that twice, I think, but if I remember correctly.
Yeah, cool. And so this idea of live, I mean, it seems like even when I'm listening to your music recorded, that like one of the things that adds a lot of depth is this live aspect and almost like capturing environment in some way and making it musical. Is that something that's always been there?
It has, without initially it wasn't like a plan. I do make music in the studio, and then I also make music in the live ceremony space. And I have seen them as like there's of course lots of crossover, but they're very different experiences because one, it's one and done, and you're improvising and you're riffing off of people in the room and what's happening, and that's a very unique experience in itself. Where in the studio, if I'm improvising, you can start and stop, or come back to it, add layers, or bring other musicians in a week later, a month later, a year later, or collaborate with other people in sort of intentional ways. So they're just different flavors. And I found in the ceremony space that if I wasn't in that improvisational zone, it didn't really work for me to perform like songs I'd practiced or had a plan, because it was really critical, or I felt important to respond to what was going on just intuitively and be responding to, like, I think this sort of chord wants to come out, or these instrument, okay, this instrument wants to come out. And in that way, it's very alive to a very particular thing happening. And I just did that for so long. I still do that, that it's just become a bit second nature. I don't really question anymore the modality or the method. It's just more like, how do you keep that particular method seeming fresh for me and alive just as an artist?
Killer. So every live show is really its own creation and its own unique signature of work.
Well, ceremonies, yeah. So there's different zones. If I'm playing a concert and people aren't, it's like not the full on like what we're doing in Costa Rica. You got to meet the moment, and in that, it's a hybrid of people. Some people maybe are journeying, and some others aren't, and I can't forget about them. So it's like you kind of have to tighten up. Then I might have a set list, but it's loose. It's like, because I'm live looping and things, I can adjust the song, or if I get inspired, I can just take it in that direction. And I like to always keep space in any set for improvisation.
Are you ever adding your meditation teacher and quite a good one? Are you ever using that within? I know your voice is often there as kind of more an ethereal tone, but do you sometimes in live shows also just guide meditations?
Um, yeah, yeah. It depends, though. Again, it just depends on what we're doing, or what the venue is, or the set, or the people. But the ceremony concerts, when I do things like that, that's an in between zone. So there's definitely is like little bits of guidance happening that are very universal, and it's just a way to kind of create more of a structure around the whole experience. A little bit of dropping in, certain moments in the set. And plus, there's some words in the set from other people like Ram Dass or others like Bio Akamalafe, and so it's all sort of meant to weave together into a kind of tapestry of poetry and inspiration. But there's a bit of structure there for sure.
Cool. What was it like to work with Ram Dass?
I get asked that a lot.
I bet. I mean, he's
It was
incredible.
amazing. It was amazing.
Yeah.
It was a dream come true. I was nervous and excited, and looking back on it, I just feel so grateful to be able to spend time with him while he was alive, and on top of that, to be able to collaborate with him and be in his home doing that. And it's the organization Love Serve Remember is still, it feels like a partner in a family, and so we continue to do things together. And like the documentary I'm working on that I mentioned, Music for Mushrooms, Ram Dass is in it. So there's a whole scene of me talking about that experience, but then trying these techniques. See me playing music at one of the Ram Dass retreats.
Oh, cool. Is that so? That's how you came across them? Is that you were playing music and then got to know the group and then asked if
No,
you?
no,
I guess.
no. That was all
Yeah.
after. No, initially I had no contact with them, I did a podcast with Raghu Marcus, who's the executive director, and so we got to know each other a little bit. And I just pitched him the idea. I was like, I want to do a record around Ram Dass's words, and then on top of that, I want to go record them. And thankfully, he said yes, and thankfully, it all happened. But it was, it's Maharaji, it was the mushrooms, just all was a magical unfolding. Still is.
Well, I bet. I mean, yeah, for anyone who hasn't listened to some of these tracks, definitely a place to start with is the
Ram
Ram Dass
Dass album.
recordings.
Yeah.
Yeah, incredible. Was he a teacher before you met? And obviously, I guess to some extent he was. And maybe just a little bit about who have been your teachers.
Ram Dass for sure, and it was mostly like his talks. There was one other album by Kreese. What was it called? Spacing out right now. But it was a music with his voice, and I was into that because it was a way for me to. This is before Ram Dass had a podcast, and it was a little harder to get a hold of his talks. A lot of them were gated behind different things, like on cassettes you had to buy or something, and there wasn't really a YouTube going on. So, but he had a combination that spoke to me and my background of starting out, the psychedelics, his intellectual avenues with Harvard, and then he was funny. He was a good speaker. He was self-deprecating, and it just all worked for me. It kind of spoke a language that I felt like I could trust him, and for, like, I think a lot of people have felt that over the years. And I was also got really into Terence McKenna. And the Psychedelic Salon was one of those early podcasts that was just talks, old talks. And I listened to hundreds of lots of different luminaries. That was a huge education for me of all the different people out there, the mainstays of the psychedelic scene. And then everything from like Eckhart Tolle, and then a lot of direct experience that I was having at this. This was all happening at the same time, around 2008. And I was going to ceremonies, indigenous ceremonies of ayahuasca or Lakota sweat lodges, or I had the pleasure of doing San Pedro at Machu Picchu. And so I was learning a lot from that, a lot. And on top of that, I was getting back into backpacking because I hadn't done that since I was in like Boy Scouts in Oregon. And so having lots of direct experience with nature itself, wilderness, which I had kind of lost to that when I was living in New York City in my 20s. So it all just kind of came at once. But I've always been someone who learns a lot from direct experience. I'm kind of a tough nut to crack, a bit stubborn, and I have to like experience it myself. And I'm like, oh, okay, versus it just being an idea. But once I could have some of those experiences, then when I would hear like Eckhart Tolle talk about certain, like what the power of now, that, when that book first came out, I was like, I felt like, oh, now I finally, I think I know what he's talking about. Like before, I was like, I didn't know, and then you start to see how all the mystic poetry and all these texts, it's like they all start to make a lot more sense. And because you've had that, your own experience that you can't argue with a felt experience.
Man, that is so true. The first time I read Power of Now, I don't even know why I was reading it. I think I was 17 or something like that. Probably only got through the first, 4 or 5 chapters.
Yeah, you're like,
and I just
this is malarkey.
I had no idea what he was talking about. I missed it completely. And then
It's like,
came back around.
It's now, big deal.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
Yeah.
Oh man, that's powerful. I think you mentioned earlier on you were talking about something about like once you understand the game, like it's the only game in town, or once you understand where we're heading. How does that show up for you? Like how do you microdose that in your days? What does a typical day for East Forest look like in terms of practice?
In terms of practice, or not enough practice. My main practice is music, and it's like my yoga is a kind of not a yoga in the sense of playing music, rehearsing music. Any kind of music is what helps me feel connected. And so when I do that at some point during the day, hopefully first thing in the day has meaning. It's a dramatic difference, because everything else that fills my day can be largely administrative or just the tasks of life, being part of a family. And then all the other things that come along with being an independent musician, it's a lot that we're always working on and working with, and are always trying to get multiple tasks done at once and deal with multiple uh, things in and out, in and out. And then the travel is another thing, trying to balance the travel and a lot of future planning and events. And then amidst all that, trying to just keep time for going on walks or going backpacking or having time with my partner and making sure it's a balanced life. But that's really like the main work these days is I'm very busy. And so it's just trying to not kind of lose my way and be lost in the busyness itself.
Yeah, certainly from the outside. I mean, I think it's like 8. I don't even know if this is an updated stat, but it's like 8 full albums and 6 EPs. It's enormous just in that, let
I think
alone
it's
all.
more than that. I mean, I
Is it?
think it's like 30 releases, yeah, in the last, but that's since 2008. And some of those are like a collaboration or maybe, you know, but yeah, I tend to release a lot of stuff, and I like making stuff, and I like kind of keeping things out there, and because I mix and engineer my own stuff, it's a little simpler for me or straightforward to be producing. And I like working on it because, like I said, it helps me feel okay. So I'm just sort of hacking away at it a little bit every day.
Do you you do collaborations, you do remixes, of course you do your own music. Where's the edge these days of all of it? Is there an area that has kind of got you particularly piqued or interested, or where's the development
Yeah, yeah.
happening?
I mean, well, it's this movie, this documentary we've been working on for 2.5 years, and we're just now reaching the end of editing, which is a huge, huge milestone. It's been a massive journey. It's something that I mean, yeah, that I had to stretch into all these areas that were way beyond just making music. From writing to directing, which wasn't the initial plan, to working very closely with the editor, to thinking like a producer, like how, and then working with the executive producers about about distribution, and then the technical side of it, and working in Premiere, which I hadn't done before. And I've just been learning a ton. And I shot a lot of it because I have a background in photography, and I majored in film in college, but I never thought it would circle back. So that was just actually really fun. And it's so collaborative that it's not like I'm working with one person, like with an artist. It's like it's dozens, of people. And so that's so cool, but it's unique. So I'm really enjoying that process, but it's most definitely an edge for me.
When do we get to get our hands on that?
Well,
Any estimates?
this year, this
Oh,
year,
cool.
yeah, that's the plan. Maybe we haven't nailed down exactly the distribution, but we're hoping Q2. We'll start to put it out there, and it'll probably be online first. So anyone will be able to see it initially, and then there'll be some touring around that with events and some screenings and music. And but the musicformushrooms.com, the site's up. It's just, you can just, it's just not a lot there right now, but you can get updates.
Get on the newsletter or whatever.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I mean, we'll definitely keep us updated, and most certainly keep us updated if you get down this way. We'd love to see you
I
live.
hope so. I hope
Yeah.
so.
So far, eh? I didn't.
It is far. We came for the first time in 2020, right before the pandemic, in February, actually. I remember flying home and a couple people were wearing masks. It was like, oh man. And then like within 3 weeks after that, 4 weeks, the whole world shut down. So I planned at that time coming back the following February. And ever since then, I've wanted to do that. And I'm saying it again. It's like I'm hoping to come there in your summer.
We're putting it
Um,
out there.
I'm wanting to do Australia and New Zealand again, and tour the film and do some music events. That's my hope. Um, Amazing community out there that I was just really warmed my heart to meet all these new people. I was like, man, I wish I could come back more often.
Yeah. Okay, we're calling it in. I wanna finish here with a couple of questions. One of them maybe kind of connecting with the past, and maybe one more with the present. If an old an old friend of yours were here with us on the podcast, and they were just telling us a story about young Trevor. Um, what sort of story might they tell of you in your youth?
Well, I think some of my friends that's from the past, especially, like I'm a bit of a curmudgeon, and I have a pretty big sense of humor and a sort of I used to have a nickname called Tricky because it wasn't one that I gave myself, but I think I was a bit of a smart ass, especially when I was a kid. And so I think one of my friends, Ian, described it as like, it's, you're sitting here talking about this and complaining about that. And then I listen to your music and it sounds like you're singing like an angel. It's like, sometimes I can't compute. And it's like, yeah, I don't know, man. It's like, I'm just a guy. And I think music and art at its best when it comes through, it isn't really yourself. It's something larger coming through and you're a conduit for that. And I meet people a lot and they project onto me. I saw this with Ram Dass all the time. I mean, when I was just hanging around in the room and it's like he's a holy man, and he is a holy man, but it's also like he's also a man. And he also could drop, and we all can do this, we can drop all of our own shame or preconceptions to say, well, I'm not worthy of. It's like you can reflect back anything to anyone in your next breath. Like you can, because you are it in a lot of ways. It's like you can be a human with your humanity and your foibles. And then you can also at the same time witness all of that and be loving awareness, which is, but there's that line of like phony holy, where it's like, when I want to I want to project it in a way because I want to cover up something. And so I very much try to just be authentic as much as I can to who I am, where I'm at, but also when you recognize that you are playing a role, we all are in different ways in these complex social arrangements. But like when you're on stage, for instance, you talked about live performance and asked about that. You're playing a role in many ways. And it's okay to play that role in a sense. It's not fake. It's just tapping into the authenticity of yourself. And in some ways, by embodying that, by stepping into it, you're engendering that truth in yourself too. And then I feel it too. And that's the joy of it. That's the adrenaline is like, I have to put my stuff on the shelf for the next 2 hours or something. It's like, and the advantage of that is like we all do when we sit down or and meditate or whatever. It's like you're choosing to you're making a choice. So you're doing the same thing when you play these roles for each other. It's the same way you could choose to your lover, to your partner, to give them a smile and just love in a glance, even if you're upset kind of thing. It's like, that doesn't mean it's not a real feeling. You're just choosing. And so this is a long meandering way of saying that level of choice for all of us is available to all of us and really important element.
Yeah, I love it. I was listening to somebody, and they were actually talking about Old English culture, and they were talking about how in Old English culture, it was very normal for an Englishman to put on a mask and to basically go and be a persona and be these kind of larger than life kind of English, politicians or whatever it was, and then to come home and just take the mask off, and that was just kind of seen as completely normal. And I think these days sometimes people almost feel like the mask is like there's something wrong if you have any sort of mask, and it's like no, that's kind of. Particularly, I mean, you're obviously we know if we're putting them on or not, or stepping into a space or
Yeah.
not, and
Well,
then
I
it's
think it's more like a tool, like tools you use, personas as tools, but that amidst it all can be a level of authenticity. Like my hope and goal is that I'm not hiding too many parts of myself, like on my own podcast, as opposed to not on it. But of course, there's things I'm not sharing because not only am I choosing not to, it's like that would be a bit gross. It would be careless. It's like I'm playing a certain role. It's like no one needs to hear about this or that. Like we all have the full breadth of the human experience and we don't need to just vomit that on everybody. We have social agreements, and but I think that's the art of it. The art of doing anything in the public sphere is how you can bring your own voice in a way that feels authentic. And that's a skill that you learn over time.
Yeah, for sure. All right, and I got one last one. If somebody today, a modern friend, somebody quite close to you, maybe a partner or a bestie or whoever is spending good time with you these days, if they were telling a story about modern day Trevor and what's going on, what sort of story might they tell?
Well, it depends who you ask. Uh, um, hmm. Well, my partner Rada and I are very close, and I think she'd say I work a lot, and in that way, maybe she thinks too much. But there's an earnestness, I would hope she would say too, in what I'm trying to do. But maybe like I could relax more, trust more, try to control a bit less, and go with the flow, as it were, and do some work to. I grew up with worrying parents, and so I think a lot of my own work is about trying to release that sense of always looking out for things, and as opposed to just like the opposite. Like, no, I'm trusting I don't need to worry about that. That's actually going to go great, you know. And that's probably the edge of a lot of my work. It has been for a long time. Doing better at it, but as you get older, you want to, because most things tend to work out. So it's like, do we need to wring the towel so hard?
Well, I hate to be somebody who really appreciates your work, but I really appreciate your work, and
Oh,
you'll probably
why hate it? Thank you. It means a lot to me. Thank you.
yeah, man, and you're probably going to be one of the first tracks my child hears when she comes into the world. So really special
What an
and
honor.
really close to my heart. And thank you so much, brother, for giving us a bit of your time today. I know it's precious, and I hope you enjoy your day.